So as Bill said, in addition to everything else that is going on here today, the pet blessing across the street, hello. And I don't know how many folks are over there, but healthy number of people and a healthy number of furry and feathered folks over there too. In addition to that, and the Oktoberfest this afternoon at 5 o'clock, this is the beginning of our season of stewardship, as he said. So if you have been in the Episcopal Church for a while, it probably comes as no surprise that this is the beginning of stewardship time, because the leaves are turning. Really, that's all it takes, right? If it's fall, you know the church will eventually be asking you to make a pledge of your financial giving for next year. As our former senior warden, Steve Rock, likes to say, some of us were born with a pledge card in our hands, you know. But actually, I am very grateful to be able to say that this year your vestry members have led the way in pledging this year literally, in the sense that all of them have turned in a pledge before the season ever started. So thank you very much to all of you for that. So anyway, stewardship is definitely about money and about giving money, but it's also so much richer than that theologically. I would suppose you can define stewardship in all kinds of ways, but for me at least, I would say being a steward is being God's manager. So that means stewardship is the faithful, loving management of what God gives us. And of course, what does God give us? Well, everything, right? Including the pets across the street, as we remember today, those outward and visible incarnations of God's love. But also, our relationships and our families and our income and our wealth and our bodies and our spirits and our planet. I mean, there is no part of our lives that we are not called to manage with love as God's stewards. And thankfully, as Bill's comments illustrated, when God asks us to be loving managers of everything that we're given, there is not an expectation that we get it right on the first try. Because our call to be stewards is a call to a journey. And thank God that is true, because at least for me, I certainly have not gotten it right, and never will, probably. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but each time a stewardship season starts, I go back to something that happened about 25 years ago. I went to a presentation at the church that Ann and I had begun attending in Blue Springs when we lived there. And this gathering was billed as a chance to get to know the church and its ministries. And Ann and I were new, and so it seemed like a good thing to show up and see what's going on. And the event ended, because it was fall, with a plea for pledges of financial support for the church's coming budget year. And I was angry. I mean, I felt like it was a bait and switch. Plus, how dare they, right? How dare they ask Ann and me for money when we were new members trying to raise little kids on an editor's salary, blah, blah, blah. But as I sat in my car afterwards stewing about it, I heard a little voice in the back of my head. And that little voice said something along the lines of, "What's up with the anger? Why does it push your buttons that they're asking you to give back to God?" This is a pattern, finally, I have come to see about myself, that if something really pushes my buttons, it might well be God asking me to consider my own stuff. Because whatever I'm pushing back against, that's probably where God is trying to tug me forward. So, long story short, we made a pledge. Now, fast forward 25 years, and we've moved to the point of tithing from our net income, giving 10% or more. And the thing is, that journey of loving management of what God gives me, it is far from over. This may be more than you want to know, but my physical and spiritual well-being could absolutely use some better management. Just because I've put in a 14-hour day does not mean I have earned a cheeseburger and fries and a glass of wine or two at 9 o'clock at night, Just because I say my prayers in the morning doesn't mean that I shouldn't be talking with a spiritual director, too. So at this point, taking care of myself is what God's putting on this steward's to-do list. And that is not, I think, it is not just the gospel of personal care, which sometimes gets in the way of the real one. Instead, the holy irony is that God blesses us with an unlikely journey, the journey of what can feel like downward mobility, a journey away from the goal of personal satisfaction, but one that actually brings us up into the last thing we'd expect to find, which is peace and joy. My hunch is that's something we could all use. As Jesus says in the gospel reading today, "Come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy," he says, "and my burden is light." Well, so celebrating the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, even if it is 2 weeks late, this is a perfect time to reflect on this journey away from personal satisfaction and into joy instead. Now, you may know some of St. Francis' story, but there is actually a lot more to it than just like Dr. Dolittle talking to the animals. Francis was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant in Italy, born in the late 1100s. As a young man, he lived pretty much into the worst that you might expect from the spoiled child of a wealthy family. Entitled, wasteful, drunk, arrogant, quite a guy. Then Francis got the chance to go off to war and play soldier, though he wasn't a soldier. But he spent a lot of his father's money to buy a horse and some fancy armor. He was taken prisoner at the very beginning of his service in that conflict and spent a year waiting for his father to ransom him. Think about that. Be interesting to get his father's take on that story. But once he was free, Francis went back to his unsavory lifestyle until he got the chance to go play soldier, this time going off as a knight for the Fourth Crusade. But as that happened, God came knocking, which kind of seems to be a pattern, right? God knocking on the door of the last person you would expect. So a day's ride out from Assisi, Francis heard God calling him to stop and go back home. It must have been a pretty persuasive conversation because he did go back home. He took back up with his old lifestyle, but he also began actually listening to God, reading Scripture. And God apparently kind of kept knocking. And Francis began to see that he had been taking the wrong road, that the life that he was leading was contrary to the call that he heard from Jesus. And one day, Francis encountered, actually what Jesus encountered in last week's gospel reading, if you remember, a leper, a broken, impoverished, smelly man with an awful, contagious skin condition. The leper, of course, was the antithesis of everything that Francis valued. Fine clothes and beauty and power and strength and wealth, all that. But Francis got off his horse and greeted the leper with a kiss of peace, like us exchanging the peace in church. And contrary to everything he knew, when he greeted that leper, Francis felt not disgust, which he might have imagined, but joy instead. And it sent him further along the journey. He heard God calling him again. this time asking him to rebuild a broken down local chapel. So Francis took some of his father's merchandise and sold it to pay for the repairs to the church. Probably not the best funding mechanism that we might take up here, but he tried. By this point, as you might guess, his father had had enough and dragged Francis before the local bishop, demanding that Francis return his money and renounce his rights as heir. So Francis took it one step further and shed his fine clothes there in the public square, tossing them on the ground and renouncing his connection to his family, acknowledging God as his only father. Then Francis left, took off, with nothing more than a brown cloak, to begin a life of wandering service to the people he would happen to meet, and preaching about loving God and the people around him. And before long, other people would encounter Francis and saw his joy and the freedom that he'd found, and they came along with him, eventually scores of them. And Francis had to organize his companion's life in some way and came up with a very simple rule of giving away their possessions and taking up the cross instead, serving the people, whoever they happened to encounter, in acts of self-sacrifice and in acts of love. There's a story, I hope this is true, it's a great story, a story told about a thief taking the hood of one of Francis's brothers, and Francis made the brother go get on a horse and chase after the thief, not to get the hood back, but to offer him his cloak as well. Jesus smiled, I think. So against all the world's expectations, this movement caught on, with thousands of people eventually following Francis's model. And over time, with a little organization, the Franciscan monastic order was born. So we are probably not going to emulate Francis's story precisely. You'll be grateful to know I do not think God is calling us to shed our clothes in the public square, so that's a good thing. But I would encourage you to consider this. Think about St. Francis's model of committing himself to God's dreams for the world. The purposes that seem contrary to his personal satisfaction. And think about the peace and freedom that Francis found, as well as the thousands of others who followed his path and the great blessing that his movement became to the world. As a steward, practicing loving management of all that God had given him, St. Francis did not find personal satisfaction in the way his culture would have encouraged him. Instead, he found joy. So, what button is God pushing for you? What unlikely joy is God trying to tug you into? And what simple yes will take you one step closer to it?